Okay, welcome everyone to our panel on education in the midst of COVID. Please feel free to post your comments in the chat box and questions for our panelists in the Q&A. This session will run until 9:45. We will then have a 15-minute break before our second block of sessions at 10 a.m. Please note again, all session links are in the digital program in your email, and our chat box moderators will also drop them in this chat box as we near the end of our session. Without further ado, I'm privileged to invite to the floor Lenny Gutierrez of Comcast, California.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. Good morning, buenos dias. Thanks for joining us today for what is truly a timely discussion. I feel inspired, just like Angelica said. There certainly is no question that these are unprecedented times for our country. From COVID to the fight for social justice, to high unemployment rates, to health inequities, to the pressures on our public education. But there is one thing for certain, none of these issues will be solved by one entity. It will take a collaboration of all sectors to come together to work towards solutions that get us and our students and their families through these times. At Comcast, we know the tremendous impact of partnerships can make on the lives of millions. More than a decade ago, we set out to help bridge the digital divide by creating the most comprehensive broadband adoption program in the country, Internet Essentials. Since then, more than 8 million low-income individuals have been connected to the internet at home through Comcast Internet Essentials program, 90% of whom were not connected to the internet at home before they had signed up for Internet Essentials. This includes more than 1 million residents in Northern California. The program is structured as a partnership between Comcast and tens of thousands of school districts, libraries, elected officials, nonprofit community partners, and media partners. We have learned that not one entity can do it alone. It does take a village. As the COVID-19 shelter in place was announced in mid-March, Comcast was the first to offer 2 months free to connect all eligible low-income individuals. We invite you to learn more about Internet Essentials by visiting the website at www.internetessentials.com. We also opened up our public Wi-Fi hotspots to everyone, whether you were a Comcast customer or not. And we announced recently we are expanding our X5 product to Internet Essentials customers, which enables parents to control and manage their children's Wi-Fi connected devices. Now, Comcast also launched a trifecta partnership of a city, a school district, a business coming together to connect our students. It's the first of its kind in California. It's certainly an excellent model for a public-private partnership with the goal to help bridge the digital divide by offering 6 months of free internet. And the leader who made it happen is one of our esteemed speakers, Sacramento Unified School District Superintendent Jorge Aguilar. We've since launched more partnerships with districts, counties, nonprofits, and cities to connect the unconnected. This week, we announced a partnership with San Mateo County. And although we have offered the service for free, we still know that low-income individuals and families that choose not to sign up might be due to fear of immigration, privacy, or lack of digital literacy skills. So we have a ways to go to bridge that digital divide, but together we can help connect the unconnected. And we know that connectivity is critical. For internet at home, it's vital for education, for employment, healthcare, social services, and more. So at this time, just really thank you to the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and the Education Committee for bringing us all together. Thank you to our esteemed speakers and moderator for coming together to discuss these pressing issues facing public education during these times. I have a 5-year-old son who just started his first virtual day of kindergarten on Monday, and a 3-year-old daughter who's eager to start preschool when she can. So I understand firsthand what many parents are going through right now. It's working together that we will find solutions facing public education. Thank you and enjoy today's panel.
Thank you, Lenny. We'd now like to turn the floor over to Mr. John Fensterwald, our panelist for the day. I'm sorry, our moderator. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm really looking forward to a vigorous conversation with our panelists on the topic public education in the midst of COVID. These are extraordinary times in education, and our panelists are in different ways are facing the challenges and are active in addressing the remedies. Let me quickly introduce them. José Aguilar was named Superintendent of Sacramento City Unified in May 2017 after serving as Associate Superintendent for Equity and Access at Fresno Unified. Toby Boyd is heading into his second year as President of the California Teachers Association. He's a 26-year kindergarten educator in Elk Grove. He co-chairs the Senate Committee on Loss of Learning and Safe Recovery from COVID-19. Heather Lattimer has been Dean of the Lurie School of Education at San Jose State since 2018. Before that, she held appointments at the University of San Diego, most recently Executive Director at the Jacobs Institute for Innovation in Education. Her first teaching job was as a history at San Jose Unified. Connie Leyva is serving her second term representing the 20th Senate District, which is in LA County. She co-chairs the Senate Education Committee, the Legislative Women's Caucus, and the Senate Democratic Caucus. Shirley Weber is completing her fourth term in the Assembly, representing San Diego and surrounding communities. She's a member of the Education and Higher Education Committees in the Assembly. She has served on the San Diego Unified School Board and is a professor emeritus in African Studies at San Diego State. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks for joining in this special event. There's so little time and so much knowledge, so let's begin. Let's start with devices and internet access. Senator Leyva, good morning.
Good morning.
Despite the efforts by you and others to secure technology, the state is still short by hundreds of thousands of computers and internet hotspots. What should be the long-term solution to the annual and ongoing needs of providing technology to students?
Well, good morning. Thank you very much for having me. The digital divide has been a problem for many years, and it's only been highlighted during COVID when all of our children were sent home and had to distance learn. I personally think that the internet and internet services should be like electricity. Everyone should have access. We have to do a better job in developing and maintaining an infrastructure in rural areas to bring access to those communities. I think the exciting part is that right now, even though so many people have worked on trying to make sure our students have devices and connectivity over the years, I think that right now, because there is such a highlighted sense and an urgency to make sure our students have them, I think we're actually going to get something done that is going to be long-term and lasting. I'm honored to serve as the co-chair of the Digital Divide Task Force with Superintendent Tony Thurman, where we have brought the ISPs, the internet service providers, together, and little things that people didn't know about. There were some ISPs that were asking for social security numbers, and we know that that meant our immigrant community would not actually sign up for fear of retaliation. So we've worked to make sure that that doesn't happen. Or being asked for a credit card, and you get the low introductory rate, and then all of a sudden, magically, it goes up. So not only are we working on making sure there is access, we're making sure that people are getting the best bang for their buck. Last week, the task force announced that we are partnering with Apple, and Apple has 1 million devices that will come with 1 year of connectivity that will be available to all school districts. And you say, oh, well, what about the money? Well, the governor in his pandemic relief fund has set aside $5.2 million for school districts, $5.2 billion set aside for school districts so that they can use that money for devices. So we feel that we're moving in a really good direction to make sure that our children have the devices they need and the connectivity they need.
Thank you. Superintendent Aguilar, how's it in one district in California? How do you stand now going into the opening of schools in terms of devices and connectivity?
Yeah, thank you for the question, John. We immediately recognized in Sac City Unified that there was going to be a need for devices and for internet access when we closed our schools in March. Over 70% of our students are English learners, they're foster youth, they're homeless, they're low income. And so we knew that technology needs were an issue before our school closure, and they still will remain an issue unless we do something significantly different throughout the state. We immediately placed, I think it was the day after we closed our schools, an order for 20,000 Chromebooks, which were delayed in customs for some time, but we immediately put to use the inventory that we had in hand. We are now able to offer a Chromebook to every student that needs one, even within families that have more students. They can also access a Chromebook per child. And then Lenny Gutierrez mentioned this public-private partnership that we're so proud of, that we formed with the City of Sacramento and Comcast, in which we pre-qualified all families that met certain criteria and are currently offering them 6 months of free internet access. Again, that is through pre-qualification. I think Senator Leyva makes a very good point. We are a very diverse community. There's a lot of concerns about submitting personal information to any entity that feels governmental in nature. We have a very strong partnership with our general counsel here, Liliana Ferrer. We're making sure that we're reaching out to families in their own languages and reassuring them that this has nothing to do with any form of immigration enforcement or any kind of monitoring whatsoever. And we'll continue to figure out how to make sure that as this pandemic evolves, that we tinker and adjust this partnership. But we're very fortunate to have partnered with Comcast and with Mayor Steinberg here in Sacramento. We've also partnered with the city. We've had some SAC RT buses parked throughout our city with Wi-Fi hubs as well, and other internet providers, and we're trying to be as creative as possible. But the reality is, and I think Senator Leyva mentioned it, we are still underfunded and undersupported when it comes to meeting the technological needs that our students have, and I think that this pandemic just manifested those needs very loudly and very clearly, and I hope that we can think through more systematically how we address this once and for all.
Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, I believe I called you Jose, and it's Jorge, and I know that because I know you. So my apologies.
Yeah.
So let's turn to distance learning, if we can, which is the purpose of the technology for the moment anyway. There have been numerous complaints last spring about the disparities in the quality of distance learning among districts and the time it took for districts to get up to speed on it. So, group, are you confident that it will be better this fall, and why? Who wants to take that first? Yes, Senator.
You know what? I just have to do a shout out to our teachers and our students, because when they went to distance learning in the spring, it literally happened overnight. So there was no time to prepare. There was no time to come up with a plan. So yes, it was a little awkward. It probably didn't work the way we all wanted it to or thought it should, but everyone did the best they could with what they had. I am confident that we'll be better this fall. Will it be perfect? I doubt it. No one likes anything. In-person learning is the best. We all know that. But teachers and school districts have had an opportunity to work on this and make sure that we have a plan going forward. So I do think it will be better in the fall. I don't think it'll be perfect, but we are living through a pandemic and everyone is doing the best they can. And I think that our school systems have done a phenomenal job of trying to get ready so that our children can learn.
Superintendent, I see you raise your hand, but let me ask you a slightly different question. Did the minimum standards that the governor and the legislature set in a budget trailer bill, Senate Bill 98, go far enough to assure that quality distance learning and live engagement will be available for all students? I'd be interested in your view, and you as well, President Boyd.
Sure, thank you, John. I'll just mention that we are still in negotiations with our teachers union, so my comments will really just be a reflection of what we're thinking and hoping for. But you know, because this is sponsored by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, I do want to just give a shout out to Carnegie. I consider myself a learner of continuous improvement and improvement science, and in those improvement methods, there's this notion of tending to what is called variation in performance. And what we saw in the spring was, in fact, a variation in the quality of distance learning. And so I'm grateful that the governor and the legislature crafted language through SB 98, trying their best to make sure that there was less ambiguity in what distance learning should look like. and would say that we still have some ways to go. We're still seeing wide variation in the minimum number of instructional minutes that should be done through live instruction, synchronous instruction versus asynchronous instruction versus independent learning, for example. My formative years were spent migrating from Mexico to Parlier, California, near the heart of California in the Central Valley, with parents who never really understood the educational impact that variation in curriculum and instruction had on me, as I spent 6 months learning in Mexico and 4 months learning in Parlier. And I would argue that that we are going to need even more clarity, because an English learner in Sacramento or in Parlier or in Riverside or in Calexico really deserves to receive the same type of instruction, quality instruction, without having to resort to whether or not negotiations address his or her particular needs, which is what we're starting to see right now. But I'm hopeful that this is a step in the right direction, John. We've heard from many of our families. I just spent 2 nights ago about an hour with our DLAC council, and parents are demanding for greater clarity and for accountability. And so I'm hopeful that we will come together and try to tend to, again, this variation that we will continue to see. But I agree with Senator Leyva. I mean, this is going to have to be better than it was in the spring when we found ourselves really in emergency teaching. And I'm looking forward to the process.
The DLAC, just for the straighten, is a parental advisory committee in your district. Yeah.
For English learners, yeah, our district-wide advisory committee.
Thank you. This is an important issue, so others, if you can give some quick answers. Dr. Weber, I'm sure you have some views on this. Is this where an area where local control should rule, or should the state provide a stronger hand here?
Well, I think the state has local control is important as always, but within parameters as to what we have responsibility for and accountability for it. How we establish some strong standards is what needs to happen in every school for every child is extremely important. But then teachers and districts need the flexibility to figure out how they're going to meet those guidelines and how they're going to meet those expectations. But nonetheless, all of them should meet those expectations, regardless of whether it's distance learning or whether it's divided up a school day in so many different ways and so forth and so on. We can't lose sight of what our overall goal is, and we can't relax our standards simply because we're in a crisis, especially for those kids who are generally already struggling in the district. So I think the legislature needs to put truly some guardrails and some parameters on it, and then we need to allow the districts and the teachers to figure out how they're going to get to those goals and objectives for every child in the state. It has to be a partnership between both of us.
Thank you. President Boyd, does that sound good to you?
I was going to say I couldn't agree better with Dr. Weber, and I truly believe it has to be a partnership. As both Dr. Weber and Senator Leyva stated, and Superintendent Aguilar, we went into distance learning in 2 weeks. We never did close the schools, and that's the only thing I have to push back on Superintendent Aguilar. We never closed the schools. We closed the buildings, the physical buildings, the brick and mortars, but we went to distant learning. And it may not have been stellar. It may not have been what we want at this current state, but we continued and we did the best that we could. Now, since that time, it has been incumbent on the educator, the school districts, and everyone else involved in education to improve on that craft. And so I know I can speak for CTA. We have offered various professional development opportunities for our educators to improve on that, because we saw that there was a need. And I'm sure that other districts will do the same. So will we get to perfection? No, I'm not going to say that, because perfection is having our students safely in front of us in our classrooms, where we can actually teach them the way that we have been taught ourselves. But we can get to a place where we are providing an opportunity for educational growth that's going to be at the pace at that child, and we can try to make it the best that we possibly can with all the professional development and us working together.
Thank you. Dean Lattimer, you nodded your head. I'm not sure for whom. Do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm never going to disagree with Dr. Weber. I was a San Diego teacher for a long time, and I know that she speaks with great wisdom always. You know, I think that there's certainly, we all want to be back in school. We all want to have conditions allow us to be back in school. And that's particularly important for our most vulnerable students, the youngest among them, the students who have special needs, IEPs, students who are in challenging home situations need to be back in school. However, I would also say there are some things that we can learn during this time period. There are things that we're learning about our students that may not have been visible before, but that come through Zoom. There's things that we're learning about our teachers and our schools that may not have been visible before, but that come through in Zoom. And so, you know, as much as we want to get back to school, I think we want to get back to a new normal. Getting back to the normal that existed before was an inequitable normal. It was a normal that had institutional racism, as President Pringle pointed out in her keynote very eloquently and repeatedly. And we need to realize that this is a time to not just say we need to get through it, but to really assess what is it that we want to get back to. Because it's a time period where we can rethink what school can and should look like for our students.
I'm curious, will distance learning play a bigger role in the instruction of your teachers in the future?
You know, it's certainly something that for us is an issue of access because coming to a campus, particularly an impacted campus like San Jose State, can be challenging for a lot of individuals who may find it difficult to come at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that it presents a barrier to entry for a lot of individuals. So, you know, we also would like to be able to come back to campus, but we recognize that there are benefits to having a hybridized system where there's some in-person and some that is remote in terms of supporting candidates' learning.
Actually, I was thinking in the actual preparation of your teachers. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yes, and in both, that's what I was speaking to, is talking about university populations.
Right. So you mentioned racial justice. Let's turn to that. The murder of George Floyd, a nationwide protest movement, and the disparate impact of the pandemic on people of color have raised the nation's consciousness about the continued impact of inequality and institutionalized racism. What else should the governor and the legislature do to focus on racial justice and equity in schools? Dr. Weber, maybe you start us off.
Sure, no problem. Well, one of the things, I guess, you know, when George Floyd was killed in front of our eyes, and much later on, his daughter said, "My dad is going to change the world." And I think that is happening for us right now, that his death has caused us to look very carefully at the systems that exist, because it became very apparent that this is an unjust system. I think that as we recognize that, as pointed out, we have to come, we at the legislature have committed ourselves to supposedly to come back and restore California, but not in terms of what it was, but what it should be and what it has to be in order to provide those kind of opportunities for young people, for businesses, for people of color in the state of California, healthcare, everything. This pandemic has revealed to us the enormous cracks in our system with regards to economic development and those kinds of things. And so we have been fortunate to do that. Now we have to be courageous about how we address it, because even though we're in the midst of a pandemic and we see the inequities, we have a tendency when it comes down to the budget to almost continue to perpetuate the same inequities that are there. We fought hard, and fortunately we did get 1835, thanks to Connie, Leyva, out of the Senate for us, and going forward to the appropriations and the floor. And that basically says that those kids who have been given the additional dollars that we're giving to the schools that need to go to those kids, that money should still go to them. And if any's left over, should be rolled over and given to them again. Some thought we should have relaxed that rule because they said, but everybody's in crisis, and that's true. But as we told the governor, when poor people or Black people catch a cold, when the world catches a cold, we get pneumonia. And that is so true. And we have seen that in this particular situation. So those of us in the legislature have to even fight harder to make sure that that equity is in our funding, equity is in our programs, because even though everyone is suffering, there are some who are suffering much more than others, whether it's the digital divide, whether it's they're already behind. We have kids who've never basically engaged in school since March because they didn't turn on their books. They haven't been in their classrooms. We have to find a way to find those kids, and that's a responsibility of our schools as well as our communities to make sure that every child still has that opportunity, because there's nothing worse than losing not just 3 months, but an entire year of school if we don't actually go and aggressively get those students in September and then provide additional support that they might need because they weren't there in March and they weren't there in the summer and they haven't had the kind of structure that's there. You know, we know we're now moving into an era where parents with resources are developing pods for their kids to learn. And that's amazing. That's a wonderful effort to move forward, but that will continue to create even a greater gap. And I'm not saying parents should not do what they need to do for their child, but it means that we as a system, as a state, have to recognize that when we don't have the same opportunities to develop pods because of a lack of resource or lack of expertise among parents, then we have to step in some way, in some creative way with whatever funding or that we can find or whatever volunteer efforts we can to make sure that those students don't lose out. This is a unique opportunity for us to begin to address those cracks.
Thank you. Senator Leyva, do you have anything to add on that?
So I would echo everything that Dr. Weber said, and equity is the lens that we need to look through everything. When I became the chair of Senate Education, equality is not equity, and we have to look at everything through that equity lens. I fully support ethnic studies. If we don't learn about each other, how can we ever expect people to accept each other? When we had a bill, one of Dr. Weber's bills on the floor, I was shocked by some of the rhetoric that we heard coming from other senators about ethnic studies and about racism and whether or not it existed. Racism is still taught in people's living room. You learn what you live. If we as a legislature don't make sure that ethnic studies is being taught at every level in our schools, then how can we overcome this issue? How can we overcome racism? Because not everyone lives the same way. So I agree with everything Dr. Weber said. We have a lot to do, and we have to put our money where our mouth is. We cannot continue to tell our children that they are the future and not fully fund education at all levels.
Thank you. Not to plug my own stories, but today I wrote that Assembly Bill 331 by Assemblyman Medina may be coming to the Senate very soon to the governor's desk. I'm assuming you support that. And
oh yeah,
I'm one of the co-authors, the joint authors on that bill, 331 and 1462. So
all right. So quickly, just to wrap this question up, Superintendent. Is there anything that districts on their own, separate from the legislature, can do in the area of promoting racial justice and equity?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, I mean, we need to continue to work hand in hand. I'm very proud that in Sac City Unified, we adopted ethnic studies as a graduation requirement a couple of years ago, and our current entering sophomore class is the first that will have to graduate with an ethnic studies course as a graduation requirement for all the reasons that Dr. Weber and Senator Leyva mentioned. The idea that we have to make sure that we understand how we relate to one another, how we view history through an ethnic lens and incorporate the many contributions of all groups in California. I feel honored every day as superintendent that I get to lead an urban school district that is as diverse as it is. Over 10% of our students are African American, 40% of our students are Chicano Latino, and I'm hoping that we can continue to work with the city to offset the effects of gentrification and remain an urban district that is as diverse as we are, and prove the value of ethnic studies. For so many of us, it wasn't until we got to college that we learned about our own history, and that is something that has to be rectified and ended as soon as possible. So I'm very supportive, and I would say to every other district that's interested, my philosophy has always been public dollar public good. So to the extent that we've used public dollars to do something good, and people want to learn about how we implemented this particular requirement in our school district earlier than it has, hopefully it'll be something that comes through legislation, but we did it beforehand. I'd be happy to support other school districts through just advice and bringing you to better understanding the curriculum that we're using.
Great, thank you. Dean,
Don?
yes,
Can I
yeah,
just
go
real
ahead,
quick?
President Boyd.
I can't disagree with anything that has just been said, but one of the things that we really do need to is a more diverse teaching population, because there's nothing like having someone that looks like you in front of the class giving you instruction and knowing that you can aspire to that and learning from them. So, we're going to have educators that are going to be retiring, and I don't know how we're going to do this, but we really do need to look at how we can bring more people of color into the teaching profession, in addition to everything that's been mentioned.
You must read my mind, because that was my next question to Dean Lattimer, and I was wondering if the initiatives that the state has set in motion, are they working to bring teachers of color, and are any initiatives that in fact San Jose State may be doing on its own?
Yeah, so let's talk about why this matters. And President Boyd just spoke to the importance of this. And I would challenge those who are in the audience to think about how many teachers of color you had in your K-12 experience. And my guess is that most of us can count that number on one hand. Across the state of California, there's a significant diversity gap between who our kids are, where K-12 students are, and who our K-12 teachers are. According to the Learning Policy Institute, these numbers came out a couple of years ago. About 3/4 of California's K-12 children are students of color, but only about 1/3 of our K-12 teachers are teachers of color. And that has a direct impact on student success, as President Boyd points out. There have been multiple studies that show that having a teacher who reflects your own experience, it has a significant impact on the likelihood to graduate from high school, as well as the likelihood to attend post-secondary education. So this is something that's critically important to close this diversity gap between our students and our teachers. So what are we doing both within our program and across the state? One is outreach. So for us, we're reaching out to middle schools, high schools, community college students, and we're talking about education as a career pathway that's about change, that's about transformation, that's about impact. And if you want to be an agent of change, if you want to have that positive impact, to consider teaching as a career pathway for you. We're also providing scholarships and targeted funding support. There are some funds that are available through the state. Within our own institution, we've made an Impact San Jose Fellowship that's for teachers who want to have that impact, who commit to working in Title I schools, and who themselves are bringing experience as students from ethnic studies programs, as individuals who represent the diversity of our communities. We have new pathways into teaching. So a few years ago, the state began an undergraduate teacher education program, which means that a huge barrier of having the expectation be that you had to attend post-baccalaureate programs to get a credential has been lifted. We've combined that also with combined programs that include master's degrees and credentials, bachelor's degrees and credentials. And we're working on a degree completion program for paraprofessionals, because we know that our paraprofessional workforce is much more diverse, much more connected to their community oftentimes than our K-12 teachers. And so how can we ensure that there are pathways for them to go into the teaching profession, which both provides a sustainable income for their family and also provides them with a leadership opportunity within their schools and communities. And then we're also doing some residency programs. In particular, I want to call out, we have an ethnic studies residency program in partnership with Eastside San Jose Unified High School District, and Superintendent Funk I saw was on the call earlier. And that work has attracted a number of different students who may not have considered pursuing education as a career pathway, but are now doing that work.
Yeah, so do you think that programs like residencies will help with the retention of teachers, which is another issue, and are there other ways that we can encourage the new teachers to stay in teaching?
Yeah, and that's a huge, huge issue. So we do know that residencies have a direct impact on the longevity of teachers to stay in the classroom, but and that's one piece. But I think there's far more work to do, and we know that teachers of color, in part because they are sometimes one of a handful of teachers of color in their school buildings, are struggle with retention. We struggle with retention. We struggle with the possibility of keeping people in the classroom and in communities, because there's an additional challenge. There's an additional service tax that's part of being one of the few people who look like you and have your experience, and the expectation of additional mentoring, the expectation of teaching your colleagues about what it means to be a Black or brown individual in our society and how to support our students. That's something that we don't recognize oftentimes, and there needs to be support for our students and for our teachers in order to retain them in our schools and our communities.
Right. Before we turn questions to our audience, I did want to ask about funding. And this year, schools are scraping by through massive deferrals, in which they receive their payments late and therefore have to borrow the money, and a lot of money from the Federal CARES Act, about $7 billion. Next year's funding, assuming a deep recession continues, will maybe worse. So President Boyd, what can be done to provide for adequate and stable funding for schools?
That's the $1 million question. I probably say
Billion.
Yeah, question. What CTA is looking for is to have a stable funding source for education, which we need. Prop 98 was originally set up to be the minimum, the baseline. It wasn't meant to seem as if it was the ceiling. And how we go about that is going to be, there's various things that's coming through the legislature right now that hopefully will bring some more revenues into the coffers of education. We have Proposition 15 that's on the ballot right now that will hopefully pass, and it's going to bring some money into the coffers of education and the communities, and that's what's the beautiful thing about the schools communities first. But we have to keep this in mind. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, but we are in the lower 25th. I mean, we are in the bottom quarter of funding for our students. And we need to make sure that education is a priority. And right now, I can't say that education truly is a priority. It was this year in the legislature, and I have to thank the senator and the assemblywoman right now. But we don't need to be playing this dance game. It's like, okay, who's going to punch our card now to say, okay, we're going to have the funding in order to do the things that we need? There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to start the schools up with the necessary protections that we need. So we are going to be looking out for other avenues and other revenue streams in order to make sure that we can fund what we need in order to truly reopen and continue and not have to do the dance. So I wish I had that answer, because like you said, that is, multiple billion-dollar answer. But I know that we have some very creative and mindful leaders here and across the building for where I am, and we can get it done if we work together.
Senator Leyva, Dr. Weber, what's reasonable to expect in the middle of a recession in terms of asking for higher taxes?
Well, what I would say is the first thing we need to do is pass Proposition 15. Everyone should work diligently to get that passed, because that will provide one source of ongoing funding. That's the split roll funding for education. And then, even before the pandemic, I know for me personally, I was looking at how do we fund education and are we doing it the right way? Unfortunately, the pandemic hit and a lot of discussions that were happening kind of put to the wayside. We did work very hard to make sure that education wasn't cut. And right now we have a legislature that believes in education, but that can always change. So we have work to do when it comes to funding and ongoing funding, and also for higher education. Our CSUs and our UCs, they come to us every year with their handout. And I said, after 2 years of being in the legislature, why haven't we found them ongoing funding? Why do we make them come and do this every year? So we have work to do and we've got to figure it out. It all goes back to, again, if we really value our children and we really think that they're our future, then we have to fully fund education.
Yeah,
and
Dr.
figure
Weber.
out how we do that.
Okay, anything
You know,
quickly on that?
Very quickly, there's no question that we are inadequate in terms of funding our schools. As we talk about who's at the top and who's at the bottom with regards to funding, we're truly at the top when it comes to prisons. The largest prison population in the world. We've reduced it significantly, but nonetheless, we still have an enormous budget that doesn't seem to go away unless we close some of the prisons. And so I'm Chair of Public Safety. We're looking at closing a prison. We also need to understand that even as prison populations decline, if the prison is still open, the budget is still the same because the same people are there by law, by this, by that. And so we have a huge prison population. My first year on the Assembly, I think we added $1 billion to the prison budget, which was totally unacceptable. And so we have to look at the resources we have, and we have to do a much better job. With our kids in juvenile hall, we pay $250,000 a year per child in juvenile hall. It's now at $450 because we've reduced the population, but we have reduced the staffing. And we haven't necessarily put together any more resources that are helpful to those young people. Yeah. So we have money, but it is going in directions that we don't want it to go. Yeah, we're in a crisis with economics, we're there. But we also need to look at how we spend our money because that's also our value system. We have so many people in prison, and it's a difficult battle to fight because people want to be safe, and yet big prisons don't necessarily make us safe either. And we've just seen that. So I totally agree. We need to rethink our values in terms of how our money, how we spend it, and the values that we have for young people is extremely important, and we need to fund that based on our values.
Thank you. You made the case. I believe, Sarah, is there not we're asking the viewers to vote on Prop 15 right now?
Yep.
Okay, it's your chance. Dr. Weber and others made the case. If you can do that, and Sarah, is there time to do Proposition 16?
Yes, we definitely have time to do that as well.
Okay, would you flash that up, or how should we do that?
Yes, I will close this poll, and in a moment you will see the next poll.
Wow.
Nice.
And this is with about 52% of our attendees voting.
Okay. Keep in mind, this is a select audience. I don't know whether we could generalize for the state, but there it is. Thank you.
John, I can agree with Dr. Weber and Senator Leyva even more so. If we invest in the beginning with our children, with our youth, with them being a priority, then the goal is to not have them go towards that prison mentality. But if we can give them the education where they can get the hope and the skills and all the things that they need in order to be a truly vibrant person in the community, that would alleviate that need. But again, it's all about priorities, and we need to make our children, the future of the state and this country, that priority.
Thank you. We're going to have the results on 16. Sarah, are there questions that you've seen that you would like to ask? Do we have a moment to do that?
Yes, I would like to share that we are on time. However, we do have a break immediately following this. So if our panelists would like to stay a few more minutes, we are able to do that. Otherwise, we totally understand. So let's see what we've got here. So we have one from an anonymous attendee. Our company supports foster youth in education through coaching. We found that the pandemic had a tremendous impact on their mental health, which then led to them disengaging from online school. These are youth without parents to push there or coaches that are there, but of course, their coaches are not there 24/7. Are there any consideration for resources to address the impacts of the pandemic on foster youth education who are still moving around between districts, a mobile population where local control isn't as effective in meeting their needs?
I would just say that I know Senator Bell, who's done phenomenal work in the foster youth arena, had a bill that we moved in Education Committee, and I don't know where it ended up, but it was to address this exact issue. And I would just also say that we cannot do enough for our foster youth, either during a pandemic and outside of a pandemic. We need to do a better job of helping our foster youth.
Thank you, Senator.
So-
This question is for Mr. Boyd and Dr. Lattimer. Thank you for your years of service to children and for your leadership. What advice do you have for teachers and parents of young children for keeping virtual learning developmentally appropriate and engaging?
Well, I want to just say that the FaceTime on the screen has to be limited, especially for the younger ones. Again, nothing takes the place of having that child in front of the educator in person. But we can't expect them to stay online and do the needed things that we would normally do if they were in the classroom. So we have to truly monitor that and make sure that we are giving them enough time to do the online and life, but also giving them the breaks that's needed in order to do the things offline. So I think that's one of the important things that we have to keep in consideration.
Absolutely. I would second that and say, you know, really it's about figuring out what's most important, and that laundry list of things that you maybe did in the normal course of a day, maybe all of them aren't needed. What's really critically important for young children? That they feel loved, that they find a love of learning, and that they feel connected. Those pieces are most important. Read stories during the time that you have them online. Encourage children to talk about their lives and experience and tell stories. Those will provide the building blocks that will allow them, when we are able to get back into classrooms, to connect more readily to the learning experience.
Sarah, let me ask the last question, which will take us through noon, but let me just throw this out there and see if there's a quick response from someone. So how do you think COVID-19 might reshape schools when all this is done? Anyone have any off the top of your head answer to that? Yes, Superintendent.
Thank you. I think that is an excellent question, John. One of my hopes is that we will all continue to face this pandemic leaning in. I think the next frontier for those of us who believe in educational equity and social justice is going to center on how do we make sure that the gap of helping students recover lost instruction, particularly if they come from homes where families aren't able to support them, is going to be really critical for us. And I'm really grateful that on the panel we have one of our deans, because I think this is a time where K-12 and higher ed need to really commit to research practice partnerships, not wait until our academics and our researchers let us know the grave effects that this pandemic will have on our most vulnerable and marginalized students. I look forward to working with our higher ed partners and engaging in community engaged scholarship and research practice partnerships, because not all of our parents are going to be able to compensate for the effects of that lost instruction. And so I hope that we don't wait too long to figure out how we're going to address a new achievement gap that is in the horizon.
Thank you. Dean, you'll get the final word.
Oh my goodness. So I think that there are all kinds of different possibilities of what we can come out of this with. Certainly we've learned that there are, especially at higher education, opportunities for blended learning experiences that can be powerful and meaningful for students and can provide greater access for many of our students. I think, though, that I want to go back to what I said earlier of we can't go back to normal. We need to look at this not only around what's the technology and what's the distance learning opportunity, but also the equity gaps that this has exposed. These aren't new. The challenges that we're seeing about difference in access, difference in opportunity aren't something that have been brought on. They've been exacerbated by the epidemic, but they existed before. And so we really need to look at what it is that we can do differently around funding. And I'm really grateful that that was brought up repeatedly, because there is a huge disparity. We have some of our districts in this area that have twice the amount of money of other districts, and well-intended parents who are trying to provide for PTAs and foundations that are connected to their schools even further exacerbate those differences. So we really need to look at funding, we need to look at experiences of students, the preparation of their teachers, and we need to look at the wraparound service supports that we're providing for our students for their physical, their mental health, and their care beyond the school day as well.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion. Appreciate your time. And Sarah, it's back to you.
Thank you everyone for the wonderful comments. I am in the process of sharing the poll results that you should be able to see them on your screen now about affirmative action. In terms of the panel, I mean, we loved hearing your very thoughtful words. I think that when it comes to public education, we definitely do need to do what we can to support our students, whether that's by funding or programming. Thank you all for your presence today. We are going into the break session now. We did lose Senator Leyva, so thank you all for staying with us as long as you did. Please come back after the break.